Hello, Soc 150 students. I want to show you one more thing for your UCR projects. In this tutorial, I will show you how to calculate a percent change. This calculation allows you to answer the question, overall, did arrest rates go up or down? Calculating percent changes is a requirement for your final UCR paper. First, I will demonstrate how to calculate percent changes in my analysis of the BJS UCR data. This is the data set in which I compared the rates of Black adults arrested for prostitution and commercialized vice to all adults. I want to calculate 3% changes for each line in my line graph. This allows me to ask 3 questions. 1. What was the percent change from the earliest data point to the most recent data point? Earliest to most recent. 2. What was the percent change from the earliest data point to the highest data point? Earliest data point to the highest data point. And 3. What was the percent change from the highest data point to the most recent data point? Here's what this means for this specific set of data. Looking at the Black adults, the first question will ask what was the percent change in Black adult arrest rates from 1980 to 2014. The second question asks what was the percent change in Black adult arrest rates from 1980 to the peak. I need to figure out when the peak was. I can hover my cursor and it will show me the data points. And I can confirm between the line and my data columns that the highest arrest rate for Black adults was in 1982 at 310 per 100,000. Then my third question asks, what was the percent change in Black adult arrest rates from the peak, 1982, to 2014? So from here to here. Why do I care so much about this peak? Let me show you another example that have a different shape and explain why it's meaningful. Here are some data on the aggravated assault arrest rates for Black adults and juveniles compared to the arrest rates for all adults and all juveniles. Aggravated assault arrests are much more common than prostitution and commercialized vice arrests. I know this because the y-axis is so much larger and the rates are so much higher. There's also more dramatic change between 1980 and 2014 for aggravated assault. So the first question that I ask when I look at percent change is what was the percent change from the earliest data point to the most recent data point? So for aggravated assault, if I looked at Black arrests, in 1980, the arrest rate was 366 per 100,000 compared to 2014 when it was 280 per 100,000. That's a big change. But it's not as dramatic as 1980 when I go from 366 to the peak of 637, or question number 3, from 637 to 280. So if I only calculated the first question, I would just be looking at the difference from here to here, and I would be missing the nuance of the difference between here to here and here to here. It might not always be the case in your data that 2014 or the most recent year is the lowest. Often it is because that's been the crime trends for the last 15 years. But you might want to calculate from a high point to an even lower point. Let's go back to the sex work example. I've prepared labels for the 3 questions for Black adults and for all adults. You might consider pausing this video now to prepare your labels within Excel. This will just help you remember which calculation means what. And now I show you how to calculate the percent change. You type in the equal sign, type an open parentheses. We're going to calculate a difference. So you start with the most recent rate, subtract the earliest rate, close the parentheses, divide by the earliest rate, and multiply by 100. And then hit return or enter. The basic formula for percent change over time is difference divided by the original multiplied by 100. That's what we did here. So we have a negative percent change here. Negative is good when you're talking about arrest rates and crime rates because negative means that there was a decrease, that the rates went down. Here's how to interpret this number in writing. From 1980 to 2014, the prostitution and commercialized vice arrest rate for Black adults decreased by 77%. One more time. From 1980 to 2014, the prostitution and commercialized vice arrest rate for Black adults decreased by 77%. How does this compare to the change for all adults? Equals, open parentheses, the most recent rate for all adults, subtract the earliest rate for all adults, close parentheses, divide the earliest rate, multiply by 100. Also negative, a 64% decrease. The decrease was smaller for all adults compared to Black adults. So for this, you could write from 1980 to 2014, the prostitution and commercialized vice arrest rate for all adults decreased by 65%. You could note that this rate was a less dramatic decrease than the Black adults, as long as you're emphasizing elsewhere in your paper that there is a dramatic difference in the rates between Black adults and all adults. Now let's finish the last two questions. Question number 2, what was the percent change from the earliest data point to the highest data point? The highest data point for Black adults was 1982. It was a 17% increase. For this, I would write something like, Black arrest rates were already quite high in 1980 when data are first available. However, the peak for Black arrests was in 1982. Between 1980 and 1982, the arrest rate for prostitution and commercialized vice for Black adults increased only by 17%. Question number 3, what was the percent change from the highest data point to the most recent data point? Remember, you're always starting with your most recent in your formula. Now I divide by the highest. An 80% decrease. For this, I would write something like, the most dramatic change in the arrest rate for prostitution and commercialized vice for Black adults occurred from 1982 to 2014 when there was an 80% decrease in arrest rates. Then I finished my calculation for all adults to see how the percent change compares. Remember that the highest for all adults was 1983. The increase from the earliest data point in 1980 to the peak in 1983 is 37%. This was a larger percent increase for all adults compared to Black adults, however, the rate remained substantially lower. The decrease from the peak in 1983 to the most recent data point in 2014 is 73%. This percent change was slightly smaller than the decrease for Black adults. And here we actually see a less dramatic gap between the arrest rates between Black adults and all adults. Certainly this gap is smaller than this gap, and that's something that you'll be writing about in your paper as well. So that's useful for those of you that use the BJS site. Let me do this for those of you that use the FBI UCR data and looked at local agencies. This is the one where I compared the murder and non-negligent manslaughter rate in Davis to California. And for these percent changes, I'm asking the same questions, but I'm going to start with California here, and you'll see why. Equals, open parentheses. This is the one where I look at the change from the earliest point to the latest point. Start with the latest, subtract the earliest, close the parentheses, divide by the earliest, multiply by 100. Go California, decrease in 58% murder rates. Let me check my peak. It's 1993 when there was a murder rate of 13 per 100,000 population. Increase of 25% from 1985 to the peak. Now I divide by the peak. And a decrease in 66%. So nice job lowering the murder rate, California. Let's look at what happened in Davis. What happened here? Hopefully you noticed this. You can't divide a number by 0. We're essentially trying to calculate the difference of 0 minus 0 divided by 0. You can't do that. The same would happen for this one. And if we wanted to do the percent change in Davis from the peak to 2004, it's also weird. The math is going to say that we have a 100% decrease from here to here. This is the highest, this is the most recent, and the math is saying 100%. That's what's going to happen when you have this many zeros in your data. So now we have to think more intuitively. Should we actually be calculating percent changes when most of the years over these 25 years were zeros? We'd be misrepresenting our data if we wrote about a 100% decrease in the murder rate between 2013 and 2014. Of course, there's a 100% decrease when you go from one number to a 0. So again, we need to use our intuition if you have lots of zeros in your data. I double checked on the FBI page, there were only 3 murders in Davis in 2013. For a college town that usually has 0 murders, of course that's going to seem high. That was a high number. That was a big change from 0 to 3. But it isn't a good comparison. What is interesting about this graph is that the California murder rates were decreasing so dramatically that the one year when Davis had 3 murders, the Davis murder rate actually matched the rate for the state of California. You can see the merge here. In terms of broad crime declines, the Davis murder rates shows very little change during this period. And so if you have a lot of zeros in your data, you'll need to be more cautious in how you interpret percent changes. Hopefully these calculations make sense to you. These calculations provide several sentences that you can write for your final UCR paper. Happy analyzing and writing.